year is 1509. Inside the royal palace of England, dawn never truly arrives. Only the flicker of candles that fight the shadows of stone walls soaked in secrets. A young queen awakens. Her name is Catherine of Aragon, 23 years old, daughter of Spain's greatest monarchs, and newly crowned Queen of England. But on this cold morning, there are no songs, no laughter, no signs of royalty. Only the low murmur of men's voices and the rustle of parchment. She opens her eyes to see them again, the physicians. Black-robed figures standing around her bed, clutching quills and scrolls, their faces ghostly in the half-light. Their eyes avoid hers. Their hands tremble, not with pity, but with purpose. She already knows why they've come. It isn't to comfort her. It isn't to heal. They have come to examine her, to inspect the aftermath of her husband's visit, to determine by touch, by sight, by humiliation, whether their queen might finally be pregnant. This is not care. It is surveillance, sanctioned, systematic, cold, and for Catherine, this ritual, this invasion, disguised as medicine, will repeat for the next 24 years. Her body will become a battlefield, her womb, a national obsession. Catherine's marriage to King Henry VIII was never a love story. Though affection had once existed between them, it was a treaty made of flesh, a union between Spain and England, sealed not by hearts, but by lineage. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, conquerors of empires, guardians of the faith. Her destiny was written long before her birth, to cross the sea, to marry a foreign prince, to secure peace between kingdoms that had bled each other for centuries. Her body was not her own. It was a diplomatic instrument, a vessel through which history would decide the fate of nations. But peace, as history often teaches, is fragile when built upon bloodlines, for in the cold corridors of power, a woman's worth was not measured in wisdom or devotion, it was measured in sons. When a queen failed to produce a male heir, her failure was not private, it was political treason. Catherine's duty was not to rule, not to advise, not even to love. Her duty was singular, to produce a prince, an heir strong enough to secure England's throne and justify her crown. But fate was cruel. Her first pregnancies ended in tragedy, stillbirths, miscarriages, infants who breathed for only moments before returning to silence. The physicians showed no sorrow. They treated her body as a problem to be solved. They wrote reports, exchanged theories, and charted her failures as if she were a malfunctioning instrument of state. The palace, once alive with music and the scent of feasts, transformed into a labyrinth of whispers, a laboratory devoted to a single desperate goal, a son. After her third failed pregnancy in 1513, the royal doctors began what they called assistance protocols. Their knowledge was an unholy blend of astrology, superstition, and corrupted science theories, masquerading as divine truth. They believed conception could only occur when the queen's body reached perfect harmony, when the planets aligned favorably, when her humors were balanced, and most disturbingly, when she experienced pleasure during intercourse. To them, pleasure was not a sin but a requirement, a key to unlocking fertility, and so they set out to manufacture it. In journals preserved in the British Library, Henry's physicians described giving Catherine mixtures of Spanish fly, mandrake root, and powdered ambergris. Each dose was recorded, each reaction noted. Before her scheduled nights with the king, the queen was dosed, observed like an experiment, and her body's responses catalogued in chilling detail. When those elixirs failed to yield results, the physicians grew darker in their logic. They proposed what they called conception facilitators. If the queen's desire could not be sufficiently stirred by the king, they reasoned, then perhaps the presence or touch of other vigorous men might help, not to replace the king, but to stimulate her humors before he arrived. It was obscene, and yet entirely official. Spanish ambassador reports from 1515 mention Assistants of great vigor summoned to court. Letters from Rome speak of papal permissions granted for unconventional remedies. In matters of royal succession, even Henry himself, years later, hinted darkly at extraordinary efforts made in pursuit of heirs. But the most damning words came from Catherine herself, in letters written in cipher to her sister. Maria of Aragon, later decoded by historians. Catherine described her humiliation with unbearable clarity. "They make of me an instrument, not a wife. They say it is for the good of England, yet I am treated as less than human." She wrote of being forced to drink strange tonics, to endure invasive inspections, to participate in rituals dictated by men who claimed that faith and pleasure must combine for God to bless her womb. These were not acts of medicine. They were acts of control. Then came the confession. Dr. Fernando Lopez, Catherine's Spanish physician, returned home in 1518 and confessed before the church. He described, in trembling words, a systematic program of conception, 14 men, chosen by physicians and approved by clergy, whose role was to assist in preparing the queen for reception. Whether Lopez meant full intercourse or ritualized stimulation remains uncertain, but the conclusion is chillingly clear. Catherine of Aragon endured invasive, repeated procedures involving multiple men under medical supervision. It was not passion. It was protocol. It was sanctioned by the church, justified by science, and driven by royal desperation. Between 1510 and 1518, she conceived 6 times. 5 children died before or shortly after birth. Only one survived, Princess Mary, the child who would one day become Queen of England. But to Henry, Mary was not enough. No prince, no heir, no stability. And so the experiments deepened. By now, the physicians referred to her womb as stubborn, as if it were a defiant machine, refusing to obey orders. The royal treasurer's ledgers recorded endless purchases: musk, crushed pearls, ground gemstones, powdered horn, all meant to sweeten and warm the queen's body. She was made to drink these poisons, to bathe in them, to have them rubbed into her skin. When those failed, the doctors turned to fumigation, burning herbs beneath her body, claiming the smoke would open the womb. They bled her according to the moon's phases, inserted herbal pessaries, and induced fevers they believed would purge her bad humors. Each attempt left her weaker, paler, more broken. But the men around her saw none of that. To them, it was simply data. The palace that once echoed with celebration now whispered with despair. Every corridor carried the scent of medicine and incense. Every night punctured by prayers and muffled sobs. To the court, this was duty. To Catherine, it was torture wrapped in faith. Her letters grew more desperate. "I am watched, touched, and measured by men who speak of me as land that refuses to yield." Her body, her faith, her privacy, all stripped away in the name of succession. And yet she endured. She endured because queens were not allowed to break. Years passed. The palace that had once been a theater of grandeur was now a mausoleum of whispered prayers and failed hope. Catherine's face, once radiant and youthful, grew thin. The sparkle in her eyes dulled beneath layers of ritual, fatigue, and quiet despair. The men around her called it God's test. She called it punishment, though she could never tell whether it came from heaven or earth. Her body had become a ledger of losses. Every miscarriage, every blood-stained sheet, was recorded and signed by physicians who bowed before her, not out of respect, but out of procedure. Even her grief had a timetable. Even her tears were measured. By 1519, Catherine's health had begun to collapse. The tonics burned her stomach. The bleeding came in waves. Her sleep was haunted by the smell of smoke, herbs, and the faint echo of Latin prayers murmured by priests who swore that faith could cure the womb. Still, the physicians persisted. They spoke of hope renewed, conditions improving, the queen's cycle promising. Every month, the same ritual repeated. a blend of false comfort, medical intrusion, and royal expectation. And when nothing came, when the queen's body once again betrayed the kingdom, silence fell like snow. No one dared speak. No one dared look her in the eye. By now, Henry VIII had changed. The young, charming king who had once knelt before her, pledging loyalty and love, had hardened into something colder, a monarch obsessed with legacy. He saw himself as God's chosen ruler, and God, he believed, would never deny a righteous king his heir. So if no son was born, the fault could not lie with him. It had to be her. Rumors began to stir, quiet at first, then louder. Some whispered that the queen's blood was cursed, that her marriage was tainted in God's eyes, for she had once been wed to Henry's brother, Prince Arthur, before his death. Others claimed the queen had offended the saints, that her body had been defiled by unholy rituals, that her barrenness was divine retribution. Henry did not silence these voices. He encouraged them. It was easier to brand her cursed than to admit the truth, that the crown had turned her into an experiment. By 1525, the palace had changed in more ways than one. New faces appeared, younger, bolder, more radiant. Among them was a woman whose charm caught the king's eye and refused to let go. Anne Boleyn, where Catherine was dutiful and devout, Anne was vibrant and daring. She mocked the court's old traditions, refused to share the king's bed until he promised her the crown, and whispered to him that God would grant a son if only the union were pure. And purity, she said, could not exist while he was married to a woman cursed by heaven. Catherine knew before anyone told her. The king's visits grew fewer, the courtiers' smiles colder. The physicians stopped recording her cycles altogether. For the first time in her reign, her body was ignored. The silence, after years of endless examination, was almost worse than the scrutiny. She had been reduced from queen to patient, from patient to specimen, and now to nothing at all. In 1527, Henry took his grievance to Rome. He claimed his marriage had been invalid from the beginning. Then he had sinned against God by marrying his brother's widow. He petitioned the Pope to annul the union, arguing that England's misfortune, the lack of a male heir, was divine punishment. There was no mention of the years of experiments, no mention of the assistants, the tonics, the humiliations, the ritualized invasions that Catherine had endured. All of it vanished, erased from the royal record, as though it had never happened. A new story was written, one of divine will, not human cruelty. And history, obedient, as always, followed the king's version. Catherine refused to accept it. She stood before cardinals, ambassadors, and priests, declaring her marriage lawful, her conscience clear. She swore she had been a true wife, faithful in body and soul. But what she could not say, what no one would dare allow her to say, was that her faithfulness had been violated by the very system that now condemned her. For to admit that truth would have shattered not only the church's authority, but the moral foundation of an empire. Years of legal warfare followed. Catherine was moved from palace to palace, isolated from her daughter, Princess Mary, watched constantly by guards. The same hands that had once measured her pulse now controlled her letters, her visitors, her prayers. She was forbidden to see her husband. When she wrote to him, pleading not for her crown, but for mercy, her words returned unopened. "I have done nothing to offend you," she wrote. "If I have failed in sons, I have not failed in faith." But faith was not what the king wanted. He wanted freedom. He wanted Anne. He wanted a son. And so, in 1533, he broke from Rome, defied the Pope, and declared himself the head of the Church of England. Catherine's title was stripped, her name erased from prayers, her household dismissed. In the eyes of the crown, she no longer existed. Yet even then, in her isolation, Catherine wrote quietly, defiantly, secretly, her letters. many destroyed, some surviving in fragments, reveal the mind of a woman who refused to let the men who broke her body also break her. Sol Chi wrote of the doctor's cruelty, the endless potions, the burning herbs, the cold hands that treated her flesh like property. She wrote of the priests, who blessed her suffering as holy sacrifice. And she wrote of Henry, not with hatred, but with a sorrow so deep it almost reads like love twisted into resignation. He was once my husband. I cannot curse him, yet his love for me has become my undoing. By the time she reached her mid-40s, the bleeding stopped. The physicians called it the closing of the womb. Her vitality, once a matter of national interest, now meant nothing. She was left alone with the remnants of her faith, a rosary, a prayer book, and fading memories of a youth stolen by duty. Her servants described her as gentle, endlessly kind, and quietly haunted. Even those who despised her pitied her. The queen who had been treated as an experiment had finally been discarded as a failure. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. She was 50 years old. The official cause, cancer of the heart. But many historians believe her death was hastened by years of toxins, bleeding, and stress, the accumulation of 2 decades of cruel medicine. When the news reached Henry, he wore yellow, the color of celebration. He did not attend her funeral. Catherine was buried, not as a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales. Even in death, her crown was denied. Her daughter, Mary, was forbidden to mourn publicly. Anne Boleyn was pregnant. The court rejoiced. They believed the prince was coming at last, but fate, ever merciless, had one final twist to deliver. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, no son. And within 3 years, she too would be executed for adultery, a crime born not of sin, but of the same desperation that had destroyed Catherine across Europe. Catherine's tragedy was not unique. In France, in Spain, in the German courts, other queens and noblewomen endured similar torments, each subjected to the same medical programs designed to force conception, each told that suffering was divine duty. Their names were forgotten, their pain recorded only in medical notes, in the same cold, detached tone that stripped them of humanity. 5 centuries later, those documents still survive. The physicians' journals, the papal dispensations, the royal expense ledgers, all written in the calm, bloodless language of bureaucracy, applied tonic to the queen's thighs. Observation: body temperature favorable, recommended continued preparation. Lines that read, not like cruelty, but like routine, not like sin, but like service. That is the true horror. The men who violated Catherine did not think they were committing evil. They believed they were serving God, science, and the crown, all at once. They believed they were doing what was necessary, and that belief, that calm, reasoned conviction, is what made their cruelty unstoppable. Catherine's story is not the tale of one woman's suffering. It is the reflection of an entire system, a system that turned women into vessels of empire. Their worth determined by the sons they could produce. A system that used faith to sanctify intrusion, and medicine to disguise violation. A system that recorded every act of agony with ink and quill, labeling it treatment. The horror did not lie in secret chambers or sadistic hands. It lay in the normality of it all. The calm, methodical precision with which they erased her humanity. In the archives of London, Rome, and Madrid, her name still appears, not as victim, not as martyr, but as data, ink strokes on parchment. Her life summarized by one sterile phrase in the royal annals of England: the marriage produced no male issue. That is all history chose to remember. Not her faith, not her endurance, not her suffering. Just the absence of a son. And yet, centuries later, her story endures, whispered in the margins of history, resurrected from forgotten letters and sealed reports. Because Catherine of Aragon was more than a failed queen. She was the first to be broken by a machine that would go on to consume many more. A machine built of church, science, and crown, each feeding the other's lies. She died believing in God, but perhaps, in her final moments, she understood the cruel truth of her life, that she had never been the beloved wife of a king, only the property of a dynasty desperate for an heir. 500 years later, the ink still gleams on those pages, not red like blood, but black, permanent, and indifferent. The doctors did not hide what they did, because they did not think it was wrong, and that not the poisons, not the humiliations, not the silence, is what makes her story truly terrifying.